Welcome to another episode of How It Works with Holger. Today we're going to look at a second encoding, how to encode URLs. URLs are something that we all work with every day, multiple times. Whenever we access a page on the internet, we use them. They have become common knowledge and they're nothing special for developers anymore. Today, every school kid, every grown-up knows what a URL is and how it works. Maybe not under that term. Most of the people most likely say, hey, this is the internet link, the internet address, but all refers to the same thing. There is something special that we have to consider as developers when we use them, because sometimes we want to use URLs to access a certain resource on the internet, and the resource that we're looking for might contain special characters that are not valid inside of a URL. Yes, you might have seen it too. Whenever you see like a % sign inside of a URL, that is the case, that other character is being used. One of these examples is using web services and adding parameters to your URL. These parameters most likely will contain, if you're working in Europe, umlauts or characters with a CD, for example, in the French language, and these characters have to be encoded. Also, when working with Xdata, you have to use quote marks with your parameters if they are strings. And these quote marks have to be encoded so that your resource can be understood or can be searched for by the web browser. This all might sound very complicated, but it isn't. Delphi comes with functionality inside of its runtime library to take care of all of that. And also, TMS adds a little bit of candy on top so that you can use it cross-platform with their FNC Core package. I already started building the demonstration application for you. I have two edit fields. To be precise, it's a T Advanced Edit. That is a control you find in the VCL UI pack from TMS. It makes it easier to use an edit control with a bound label. So you not only have the edit control, you also have, if you scroll down in the properties, let me see right here, you have these properties starting with the label prefix. And these allow you to specify a different label font for the label, but also the label position. And this makes the edit control very flexible for any sort of design without you having to keep track of where your labels are. You simply select the position, LP top left in my case, so it lands right at the top left side of the edit control. Very convenient and very easy to use. For you, as the user of the edit control, nothing changes. You still use the name property to assign the name to your edit control. And then you also have the text property to access the values inside of your edit. But as always, with advanced edit controls from TMS, you also have special properties to access numeric values and to change the editor that you only want numerical values. Just as an aside, before we dip into the actual topic of URLs. So I prepared two edits, one for the unencoded string and another one for the encoded string. And you might think, like, why is he talking about string and not about URLs? Because we want to talk about URLs today. Well, it's a little bit more detailed than that, because if we look at the documentation from Embarcadero, we find that TNet encoding for the URL part is not documented at all, sadly. So the only thing we can do is we look at what is being encoded when we use certain methods from the runtime library. And that's how we find out what we can use. So looking at what I prepared so far, I use system.net encoding. I introduced this unit in detail in a previous episode for base64 encoding. Have a look there, how it works. I go into detail about class methods and class properties. Have a look there to get an introduction. I don't want to repeat that here. And I have the method called EncodeURL that will take care of encoding the text specified in a URL, and it returns a string. We'll implement that now. And the edit control txt unencoded implements the event onChange, and this onChange event then sets the text of txt encoded to the encoded part. And that's what we're going to implement now. Code completion reveals a lot about that URL encoding possibilities, because if we now type encode, we see that we can encode paths, auth, query, and form. These are the 4 possibilities of encoding we have, and then the unspecified encode that allows us to specify a set of characters that are also considered unsafe in addition to the characters that the Delphi RTL considers unsafe. And we also have a set of options, encoding options. For example, we can specify how spaces are treated, and also at the end we can specify an encoding for the string, which is a different kind of encoding that we're talking about right now. The encoding of strings is how the different characters inside of a string are encoded. For example, UTF-8, UTF-16 for Unicode encodings. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about an encoding, how to send a request to an internet resource that a web browser or a web service, any web server on the internet actually is able to understand what we want. Let me give you an example. Looking at the doc wiki from Embarcadero for the TNet encoding URL, we see that we have a URL which consists of the protocol, that's the first part of each URL, and then the subdomain, and then the domain name embarcadero.com. And this part here with the slashes, that is what we consider the path of the resource. And one part is missing here, and that is very often used in web services, parameters, the so-called query part of the URL. For example, if I look for a person, for example, we say first name equals Holger and ampersand to connect the two, second parameter, last name equals Flick, for example. And the key thing here is that these characters are special characters that are indicating, hey, the query string starts now, and this equal means the parameter first name has the value Holger. And that is key to understand, that whenever you encode URLs, that these special characters cannot be encoded, because otherwise they lose their functionality. And with xdata, you have to specify strings like this. And what you see is happening automatically here from the Chrome web browser, that the Chrome web browser automatically encodes and does not send the quotation marks to the server. And that is exactly what we have to do when we write our Delphi applications ourselves. We have to do this encoding. We cannot send this or use this URL with the quotation marks. We would incur an error because these are invalid characters. On the other hand, we have to make sure that the ampersand and the question mark and also the beginning here is not being encoded, because those are special characters that have to stay the way they are. However, if you use, for example, a comma in here, that is part of the string that has not to be encoded. But if you use a comma somewhere else, it might have to be encoded. And for that, we have different methods in the tnet encoding.url class. And that is the thing that makes it a little bit tricky, because without documentation, if you go to the TURL encoding class, you see that the methods, for example here, encode auth, no documentation, encode form, no documentation, and that makes it difficult. However, the path and the query are pretty self-describing. It means for the path, you use this. If you want to encode this part here, you use EncodePath. If you want to encode the query part of a URL, you use EncodeQuery. And encode form I'm 99.9% certain it is designed for the form part of an HTTP request, which has nothing to do with the URL, but with the form encoding inside of an HTTP package. But this is just me guessing. And the same for the auth. It is supposed to be used for authentication inside of a URL. However, as it's not documented, I can only guess. And what is also interesting is that Embarcadero says you can use encode and decode right away without using any special methods, just using encode and decode. And they give an example of what's happening. They literally encode everything except these special characters that they list right here. And those are exactly the characters that I've just mentioned, like the ampersand, the forward slash, the question mark. Those will stay as they are. However, everything else gets encoded. And if you just use the encode method, you just have to be very, very careful if how you specify the space as plus option that you can specify as well. So that's why I think we should stay away from this one and rather use the specific URL encoding methods. That's what we're going to do. So I think as a good start, we start by encoding the path of a URL. And you'll see exactly what's going on. Just let me add something else. When we create the form, we set txt encoded.text to nothing. We do it with the unencoded text because that should trigger that the encoded text is also empty. Let's see if that works. Yes, it does. So unencoded string, let's say we have, looking at the example right here, we have this one. So we copy that over and it should pretty much, because this is an encoded URL, it shouldn't be changed. So here we go. And we see that nothing is happening. Why? Because we forgot to assign a result. So that is very important. Of course, EncodePath returns a string, and this string has to be assigned to the result of the method, of course. So restart and paste. And you see if the string is empty, the forward slash is added because we say, hey, we want to encode a path. So path has to be at least one dash. So if we paste now, we see that the encoding is as it should be. Nothing is getting changed. However, if we were to use a comma works fine, or an ampersand works fine too, braces works fine too, but a hashtag inside of a path is not allowed. So you see, it gets encoded. So let's see other special characters. For example, let me try German umlauts. Switching the keyboard, and you see that now these things are getting encoded, just as, for example, quotation marks. They're valid here, but the double quotation marks are not valid. So this is a method designed for the path. So in order to use it, you would encode the domain name and everything inside of your application without calling the encode string, but the string that might have to be encoded, that is what you use with EncodePath. And next is EncodeQuery for the query part of a URL. Let's see how that works. And this is the only way to find this out. If you have something that is not documented, what other choice do you have, right? So here you go, and we say question mark, first name equals Holger, and second name equals, like, for example, as you see, that works fine. But as soon as I now do what is required for Xdata, I'm going to switch back to the American keyboard, then we see that the quotation marks are being encoded, just like you saw it in the Chrome browser. So this is something you would use if you generate a URL to query information from a web service or web service API, which requires quotation marks around strings so that they're encoded properly. But you want to be able to use the ampersand to separate your parameters, and you also want to be able to attach the question mark as a query string to an existing URL. So this makes it very, very easy to create query strings for URLs for parameters. And of course, you can combine this using format, for example, inside of your application to fill in the values inside of the quotation marks. But it is very important that these quotation marks get translated and encoded. And also, I think inside of the string, if you have international characters, those have to be encoded as well, as you see right here. So as a detail, what is this encoding? Of course, this is the percentage sign denominates, that is a special character following, and these two are in hexadecimal format, specifying exactly which character it is. These are the two, EncodeQuery and EncodePath, and these give you the ability to encode any URL you might need, because you can combine the two. You say EncodePath plus EncodeQuery, and you're good to go. And the base URL with HTTP, and this is something I wanted to show as well. If you, for example, type HTTP, that has no effect on anything that you type here, because this is just designed for the query string. So you can do this, and it will only encode something that is inside here. So even that will work. Article ID 47, and if you wanted to do a string again, this will be encoded perfectly fine. So EncodeQuery might be appropriate for your complete URL as well, because it only encodes specific parts that might need to be encoded to make sure that the query results are correct. However, be careful with EncodePath, but be even more careful if you just use encode. And this is the one that is being documented, the only one that's being documented. Let's try that. And I think you'll be surprised what's happening there. So if you type HTTP :/, you see everything is getting encoded by default. So that is definitely not the result that you want. That's why I explained to you the other options first, because this is definitely not the encoding that you want for URLs. Of course, there are special characters, or that you can say, hey, I want to say these are valid or these are not valid. And why would you use them if you have these nicely prepared EncodeQuery and EncodePath? There's really no need. And if you're looking for a platform independent solution that can be used on any platform that is supported by Delphi, then you can use the TMS FNC Core library, which supports multiple platforms and also has in its utilities a URL encoding method provided just for you. So TMS FNC utils is the unit that we have to use. And then instead of using tnet encoding, we're going to remove that. We're going to use TTMS FNC utils. And this is a list of all the utilities that are available for all platforms. So you can use it on the web, in the VCL, on FireMonkey. All of that is available. If you want information for all these, have a look at my book, number 2 of the hands-on series. It's hands-on with Delphi, book number 2. The main part is about FNC maps, but the utilities are explained in great detail. They have their own chapter. You'll get examples and explanations for all these methods that are in there. And also in there is the URL encode function, and also open URL. So you can open a browser window, again, platform independent, to show the URL, the content of the URL. But be careful with URL encode, how TMS implemented it, because TMS also picked an implementation that you as the developer have to be aware what needs to be encoded and what doesn't. This URL encode function from TMS will always transfer or encode all the characters, meaning if you have the base part of the URL, like HTTP, you see that gets completely transformed as well. And the same for equals. So this method really encodes any character and doesn't have any characters that it doesn't encode. So that comes closest to the encode method from Embarcadero, and I'm pretty sure that's the reason why they picked it this way. But you as the developer then have to be very, very particular that you only, for query strings, for example, you only encode the actual parameters and not anything of the text around it. So for VCL, the best solution most likely is the Delphi runtime library using EncodeQuery or EncodePath. And then if you look at cross-platform, TMS provides you with the utilities to be pretty safe encoding your URLs. You just have to be careful that you encode each part separately, and provides the parts that do not have to be encoded with the special characters like ampersand, question mark, forward slash, that you provide these separately as part of your strings without calling encoding on those. And that's all there is to URL encoding with Delphi using the RTL or using FNC Core for a cross-platform solution. If you like this topic, subscribe to this feed that you're not going to miss another episode of How It Works with Holger. And as always, it helps us if you give us a thumbs up so that we get a better rating, and also that we see that you really like this episode so we know what kind of topics to pick for future episodes. And as always, I'm available for training, consulting, for everything Delphi. Just contact me at holger@flixengineering.com and I'll reply at the earliest convenience. Thank you for listening, and see you next time at How It Works with Holger.